Welcome to Beneath the Armour podcast, the place where healthcare professionals talk about what it's like to be them in this challenging field, and a place where listeners can come to feel connection through shared experience. Welcome to episode number 7 of Beneath the Armour podcast. In today's episode, I talked to Danny Hills. He's an associate professor and deputy dean of the School of Health at Federation University, which is in Ballarat, Victoria. I came across Danny on the Men's Australian College of Nursing website, where he was discussing what it's like to be a man working as a nurse. I got in touch with Danny several weeks back. We had an initial conversation and we decided to go ahead and record an episode for the podcast. In this episode, I had a really great time talking with Danny. We covered lots of different topics. We talked a bit about his research, looking at violence and aggression in the workplace for nurses. I asked him about his personal experience of this, and he talks about some of the skills and techniques that he found that he actually possessed, which helped him in pretty tricky situations when he was working in environments such as mental health, where patients may be potentially a little bit more reactive, given that they might be being held against their own will. We talk about Danny's strategy for career development. I asked him how he's moved around his jobs and sort of some of the reasons why he's moved and that sort of thing. And he talks about having quite a clear vision for what he wanted and being quite opportunistic. And we talk about our shared feeling that our relationship with our wives has been really instrumental and important for both of us in both our personal and professional sort of development and growth. He talks about how his relationship with his wife is like being in a team and how they've consciously decided together about where they're going to move next in their careers and in their jobs. Danny talks about his old rock and roll days from back when he was in his 20s and how more recently he's had an opportunity to reignite some of this by someone approaching him to actually publish and release some of his old music, which is exciting. Danny talks about still having a wild side. Danny reflects on the fact that whilst his identity may have shifted when he sort of moved into nursing, he still feels very much the same person now as when he did when he was younger. Despite Danny's position of seniority at Federation University and all of the things he's achieved, he really comes across and is a very understated and humble sort of person. And I actually reflect back to him in this conversation how, where he's discussing some of the successes that he's had, that it seems to me that he possesses quite a few skills in the sort of realm of emotional intelligence, which are really valuable and important in the work that we do in healthcare, which not everyone necessarily possesses. Despite the fact that Danny is a nurse by background, this conversation really doesn't go into heavy details about nursing in particular and is quite wide-ranging and talks about a number of different topics, so I hope it will appeal to a number of listeners. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Danny Hills. Danny, welcome to Beneath the Armour podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Excellent. So to begin with, I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about, you just made a recent big move in terms of, I suppose, with your career. You're in a new role. So it'd be good just to hear a little bit about where you're at now in your career, what's going on, and where you are in the world as well. So there might be some international listeners, so maybe just describing a little bit about where you're located and that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, actually, I just passed my second anniversary in this role as associate professor at Federation University. My base is in Ballarat in Victoria, which is 120 kilometres, west of Melbourne, and at the moment I'm in St Kilda, which is an inner city area of Melbourne. Very, it's on Bayside and a little bit grungy. I kind of like both those, the country and the city. It's a great combination. Although at the time of speaking we're under kind of a lockdown, feels a bit like martial law sometimes, but that's just because we're all getting a bit frustrated with not being able to do very much and not being able to travel and things. But look, everything else is good. Recently, Look, well, let's say last year, 1 year ago, it's just disappeared. I was appointed Deputy Dean, and I've just finished a 2-month stint as Acting Dean. And what a time to be Acting Dean in the School of Health at our university with all of the COVID-19 shenanigans. So it's been, it's been a challenge for everybody, but luckily I have a really great team, and my dean, who acted up to the next position up, she's fabulous, and we have a wonderful working relationship. And it's just really, even though the challenges are there, it's quite a joy to be working in this role and with the people I work with. So yeah, that's where the situation is here at the moment. I'm a registered nurse. I started many years ago in my late 20s, and worked in clinical areas for quite a long time, mainly in mental health, but also in clinical governance. And eventually I got around to doing my PhD and moved across into academia. That process started in about 2009, so 10 or so years ago, and here I am now.
So there's a couple of things that I'd love to sort of dig into today, kind of following on from when we spoke last time. One thing that I'm really curious about is obviously your research that you've done with respect to violence in the workplace, particularly for nursing staff experiencing violence and incivility as well. And I'm actually really curious to hear about your own personal experience of that, in different settings you've worked in. So whether you've personally experienced violence and any specific examples you could tell me about.
Well, when I started nursing, which was in 1984, it was the last round of hospital-based training, and my job was in mental health, so I was in an acute mental health facility. And, it's not to say that people with mental illness are more violent, but certainly if you're locking people up against their will, which is part of the role of acute psychiatric services, not all aspects, but certainly some of the wards were about people who are acutely mentally ill. They are often disgruntled with the situation. So yeah, there's a higher risk of aggression for sure. But I think one of the things about the training that we did then was it was all about de-escalation. So we learned a lot about working with people and trying to de-escalate raised feelings, raised emotions, and dealing with tensions. And we sometimes used a technique where a lot of people turn up when there's an incident, and of course when there is a lot of people there who are dressed in uniforms, it often calms people down. I think not that usually we had to resort to using physical force to restrain people, but I think that's the main thing. It was about learning how to communicate, and I think if you have already have the trust of people, it made a big difference. And that was, I guess, what I learnt very quickly there in those early years of my nursing career. Of course, aggression and violence is all around. I worked earlier as a musician, and that could sometimes be the case when people got a bit hot under the collar or drunk too much or whatever. So you sometimes saw it there. But I think as I've gone through my career, and even during a period of time where I was doing martial arts, I think the main thing is that you try to avoid confronting situations. I'm not saying that you run away, but that you look out for in your environment and try and manage that. Yes, that was a key aspect that prompted me around my research. And I think where it really came to the fore was when I moved from working in mental health services and took on what I call a clinical governance role. We called it quality improvement back then, and then it became patient safety, but it was really all of those. It was about setting up proper systems to ensure that we had safe and high quality care. So I realised that there was a particular gentleman who was causing issues for nursing staff in a ward, and for me, I found him okay. I just talked to him, and I just realised that maybe it was a skills issue, that there weren't the skills there to manage somebody's behaviour that was kind of second nature to me from my training. But that spurred on an interest in aggression. I thought, wow, I wonder how much there is of this workplace aggression thing. And of course, as I started reading a bit more, I realised that it could be quite significant. I guess we've all had issues of lateral aggression or lateral violence, where you meet up with bullying behaviours and so on. But working in healthcare, often the main source of aggression is from patients or their advocates, their relatives, carers. And that's certainly what the research shows. Well, anyway, that sparked on my interest, and I was doing a master's of nursing, and then I decided to extend that to a Master of Nursing with Honours, which had a thesis component. So I did a little bit of research there and found some interesting findings around workplace aggression in that health service that I worked in, the bigger health service. And that's where I got a taste for quantitative methods and qualitative methods too, I might say, because that little piece of research I did in the health service that I was working for in New South Wales, it was the statistics were shocking, but the feedback from the people who were working in healthcare just absolutely blew my mind. It was just disturbing. So that was, that was in the early 2000s. And I've done a little bit more. Was involved for my PhD, a very, very large national study of medical practitioners in Australia, and I managed to survey them on their experiences of workplace aggression. And of course, it's very, very widespread amongst the medical profession as well. It's not as prevalent as nurses experience, but still it's very high. On average, about 70% of Australian medical professionals experience workplace aggression within a 12-month period. Nurses, as I've found out in more recent research, it's more like 95% plus.
Wow.
So it's a very, very common experience. Yeah, really shocking. And if I may give a plug, a paper which just published in Collegian Journal is an analysis of the qualitative or feedback that we got from a sample of nurses and midwives in Victoria, and that, again, very disturbing. It's titled In Harm's Way, and I really think that's what it is. So it can be a hazardous profession. A lot of it's got to do with systems and processes. Some of it's got to do with skills, but I think that it's it's one of those things that are called wicked problems. There are many, many aspects to it that are really hard to manage in and of themselves individually, and somehow we have to kind of bring together all areas of policy, practice, legislation, design, all kinds of things that we need to do to try and solve it. And the evidence for what prevents and minimises aggression is not great. It's not very strong evidence. So, yeah, look, it's a very interesting field. I do try and investigate other areas of interest as well. So, but it's one of those perplexing problems, and I know it keeps coming back, and I keep ending up doing research around that area.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's great that you've kind of carved that out, because it sounds like such important research to be done, given how prevalent it is. I had no idea that it was such a high proportion of nursing staff or other medical professionals who experience that. So it's finding out more about the different factors involved and prevention and stuff sounds very important.
Look, I could talk for a long time on this topic, but I don't think we should. But people can read about it. It's there's a lot of literature in this area, but unfortunately no great answers.
Yeah, well, I'll put your recent paper in the show notes as well, and we can always put some other bits in there, some of your papers if people want to have a look at it. So something else I wanted to talk to you about or ask you actually was really based on a reflection of mine this week. What I often do with my guests is use it as an opportunity to reflect on things that are going on with me and just see what happens for them in their own lives. So for me, there's been a real period of change in the past couple of weeks. I decided to leave my job. I quit that and I'm moving on to something else. And it's brought up a lot of different feelings for me around, this particular job was actually going very well. I had a good position in this organization, and I had to do a lot of work around thinking about what my vision for the future was. And that led to me sort of wanting to leave this and move on to something else. And you've obviously worked in lots of different roles, and I'd just be interested to know for you how you have decided, what processes you have gone through to leave those roles, whether there has been, it was because you are unhappy, I suppose really about the emotional side of things, and how you felt perhaps leaving jobs that maybe you've been in for a long time, and what it was like leaving those teams that you'd worked in and maybe had been a sort of integral member of or in a sort of leadership capacity. Would it be all right to talk about that?
Yeah, sure, that sounds good. I joked with somebody today that it's not often that I last in a job longer than about 2 or 3 years. And that's been interesting looking back on that. And sometimes the change in jobs for me has been about an opportunity presenting itself. In fact, it often works that way. So sometimes the change in my role comes about because of a position that becomes available within the organisation, say, which I think is probably not that unusual for a lot of people. You develop skills. People decide that they can trust you, or they feel that you're doing a good job and have something to offer in, say, in a more strategic way or whatever. So that's how it has been for me often. I do get itchy feet occasionally, and I certainly get a bit frustrated when I feel thwarted. So if I feel like I've got more to offer, and perhaps if I feel that I need some recognition for that in some way, which might be like a role title and pay grade, then that can be a bit problematic. And it's either that, or sometimes I get bored if that's in the past. I couldn't say that about academic work. Academic work is just full on. So it's not a matter of boredom, but sometimes it's that you have particular priorities that just aren't able to be met within your current role. So that's sometimes been an issue as well. But I'm usually pretty strategic, and my wife and I talk about strategy around positions and roles and things. So sometimes we engineer what we're going to do next. Mm-hmm. An example, I guess, would be when I finished my PhD. As I approached the submission date, the question was, okay, there's that big post-PhD black hole. Because I mostly did it full time, had some part-time work. What's next? And here's the thing, I was looking just at Seek to see what jobs were around, and I saw my master's supervisor's name on a position in Canberra. So I thought, oh wow, I haven't spoken to Mary for ages. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that I spoke to her, and by that February I had a position there at the University of Canberra. So, there's a lot of, sometimes it's fortuitous, and you can imagine moving from Melbourne to Canberra was big. So this was a big negotiation between myself and my wife. So, Sharon and I had to make an agreement about that and how that would go, and yeah, we went there for a period of time and things changed there, and the time was about right for the period of time that we thought we would see how it went. And then we came back to Melbourne. I had secured another job at a university here. And I think it was the same sort of thing, really, with the role that I have now, that I just, I felt that it was time for me to be moving onward and upward. And again, it was the presentation of an opportunity and the link with somebody I knew, and I applied for the job and got it. So I think that's the thing, it's a bit of a mix of, for me, changing jobs has been a bit of a mix of not feeling quite right with how things are going, and just some fortuitous thing that just presents itself. So there's definitely been a bit of that. Even when I was back doing nursing, I was 27, I'm thinking, okay, I've got to do something with my life. What will I do? And then I saw an ad in the paper and I thought, wow, there it is, staring me in the face. And that's happened a few times. It's happened a few times where I've, you have to be looking. You can't, so I always keep abreast of what's happening in the field that I'm in. You're doing yourself a disservice, I think, if you don't keep an eye on what's going on around in your field of work, nationally and internationally. And certainly in academia, in academic work, you need to have an international perspective because you end up working with people around the world on projects. That's a hope, and it's a great part of the job to be able to do that. So I think if you want to move on and move around and have different experiences, you've got to be looking. You've got to be looking out for them. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it does. I really love the way you've been, like you said, you've been quite strategic, and I think it's, you didn't explicitly say this, but to me, it really sounds like, you're quite a courageous guy. You've obviously, because I think it takes quite a lot to leave a job as well. People get very comfortable in their roles, their positions. I think importantly, we build relationships, don't we, with the people we're working with and with an organization. And I think people often feel quite committed to an organization at times. And I think you're probably a bit of an outlier in how much you've moved around and been willing to take that risk and that sort of thing. Not everyone does that with their careers. And I guess you've obviously benefited from that, haven't you? Been able to explore different aspects of clinical work and academic work and those sorts of things. So I find it really impressive and admirable what you've done. So something I'm curious about is, so I know for me...
Well, look, to be honest, it's not just me, though.
Right.
It's not just me, though. Sorry, Nathan.
No, that's okay. Carry on.
I was just going to say, I notice I've got an unstable internet connection here, which is a bit of a problem. I was just going to say that it hasn't all been my direction, though, because my wife Sharon and I, it's a partnership, and we always go into these things together. And I think that's been really the fundamental thing about that. That it's been that decision-making, a shared decision-making, and we've gone for it together.
Yeah.
Which has made it so much, I think it's made it easier in a way. And, if one or the other partner doesn't feel very comfortable about it, we either talk about it and, sometimes we make a longer, okay, look, maybe not now, maybe in a couple of years or whatever. So it's sometimes that. But of course, things change too. It's like, we said we were going to go to there, and then we were going to, I think when we came to Melbourne, we were thinking about moving to another town first and then coming to Melbourne. We thought, let's just bypass that and go straight to Melbourne, which we did.
It's so interesting you mentioned about that role of the relationship with your wife. I was really thinking, in fact, I had a conversation with my wife this morning, and we're talking about the fact that the past 6 months has been really challenging and difficult, and there's been various things, some other things going on in our sort of personal lives, and also this big change for me with leaving my job and focusing more on my business. And my wife was, being very, very nice and sort of commending me for doing these things. And I said, well, actually, if I was on my own and I wasn't with you, then this would have been way more challenging. And I think we sort of forget when you're in a quite well functioning relationship that that is really supporting you with, your mental health and also with important life decisions. And it sounds like you've really benefited from that with your wife as well, sort of being a team.
That's right. That's exactly how we are. Yes, in so many ways. And in fact, that paper that I was just mentioning earlier, in fact, Sharon was the lead author on that. So.
Oh, wow. How lovely.
So, yeah, we've been working together sometimes on similar teams in healthcare and on research projects as well. So, yeah, we are quite a team. But, we have our own lives and things as well. So,
yeah. So something else I'm curious about is each time I've kind of moved on, I suppose if you moved upward or up leveled with, with my career or into a role that feels like it's going to be more challenging for me, like a higher level of seniority, it's natural to have kind of fears about, am I actually going to be good enough to do this? And if there's new skills that you might not have yet and that sort of thing. So I'm actually just really interested to know, like with your current role, I know you've been there a couple of years. Are there things that you still kind of have worries about or fears about with respect to that role and like what you're meant to be doing and what your responsibilities are?
Yes, I think there are, and often those things can be about, can be a quantity of things happening all at once. So if you're having to juggle and keep a lot of balls up in the air, that can be quite anxiety provoking, I think. That's probably that's where I get most worried. Right. Is when I've got a lot of things going and you're not sure how they're all going to resolve, or am I actually going to be able to do this? Am I going to be able to cope with all of this? So that's probably the worst thing. I think that where I have deficits, I tend to declare them if I think it's significant. Right. But I try to do something about it. So if I'm missing a skill or something, I'll try and deal with that. Find out about it, read about it, ask somebody about it. I think usually though, in most of my working roles, there's been a team. So, it's having a good team with you and working well together. That's so important. I think this is one of the things that I think about at the moment. We've talked about this a number of times over the last few weeks during these challenging times, how important the team has been, and being able to rely on people to do the best job that they can do, and have that sort of level of commitment that makes it easier in a way. On the other side, where the hard thing is where you have to confront people about poor performance or bad behaviour. So that's hard too. I mean, it's not an easy thing, but you do have to take up that challenge if you're in a role where you're required to work with people and manage them, be their supervisor, let's say.
Yeah.
And somehow help them be accountable for what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely.
So it is a mix of supporting and that, but it's it's not easy. That's another challenging aspect of many roles.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that people don't really get training in as well, is that ability or that skill in providing feedback or discussing things that aren't going so well, or if there are interpersonal difficulties like within a team or something like that, reflecting on those bit more things that stir up unpleasant emotions. Yeah, I know for me it's something that I've really consciously tried to work on, is giving feedback. I actually I did some supervisor training and had to have a video of me doing a supervision session assessed. And one thing they said was, you're very good at giving nice praise and positive feedback, but you need to make sure you're giving some constructive feedback as well. Yeah. So it's something I've done a bit more recently, and really noticed, even though I've got a good relationship with the supervisee or the junior member of staff, that I don't think it's something that I'm particularly bad at, but it's hard, isn't it? It makes us feel anxious that I don't know, for me, it's about maybe wanting people to like me in some way, and that it's going to make them dislike me if I give them this constructive feedback or criticism. How about you when you're doing it? What sort of shows up for you?
Well, I was just thinking, sometimes we might feel a bit guilty because we know we're far from perfect ourselves. So, I think that can be part of the story. I think, sometimes it's a matter of providing alternative viewpoints. And helping the person, I think, make a choice or choices between various options, which would work better, which would be fairer, which would be most supportive for the people involved, and that sort of thing. So I think, I don't think you have to be kind of dictatorial or too authoritarian. I mean, there are times when you have to tell people, look, this is just not on. This is what you have to do. If you don't do this, then there'll be consequences.
Yeah.
But mostly I think you can work with people in a fairly constructive way whilst maintaining integrity for everybody, but at least pointing them in perhaps considering different ways of acting and reflecting, thinking, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think what sort of strikes me as you're talking is I agree with what you're saying, and I would take the same sort of approach and attitude towards things. But I just know other people don't see it that way, and they find it this incredibly difficult thing. And I think part of it comes down to sort of those emotional intelligence skills, and I think also people's histories that they bring with them to those kind of conversations really has an impact. So I know if people had, if in their childhood, for example, if they were criticized heavily by their parents or that sort of thing, when they're in that kind of conversation, it may be even if they're giving the feedback or receiving it, it can feel very sort of threatening. So it's, I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? Everyone is very different.
It is. Look, I remember having a discussion with a student a few years ago, and she was quite a good performer, but it was very interesting because she had the courage to explain to me how my feedback was a bit upsetting, merely because I used the word "but" in the middle of the sentence, and I thought, wow, that's pretty sensitive. You did this really well, but this wasn't so good. And I still haven't resolved that one because I'm not quite sure, so there's a problem for me. I don't know how I could have been, still haven't worked out how I could have been more supportive.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I needed to put a full stop on the first bit and somehow introduce the negative bit in a slightly different way. But anyway, you know what I mean? Sometimes it's very hard to keep it all positive and going well. And look, I just dealt with a complaint recently from a student, and I thought I was fairly constructive, but look, it got escalated up, and there you go. You just
a complaint about you.
Just have to take. No, not about me. No,
oh.
Complaint about. Things that had been done in the school, but I think you just have to take those things on the chin. Sometimes, you're not going to satisfy everybody, and people aren't going to necessarily be 100% happy with what you propose, or So that's just it.
Yeah,
I think that's just the way things are.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned previously about, if you feel that you've got some skill deficit or something, you would consciously try and work on that. I'm interested to know, is there anything at the moment that you are, from a personal development perspective, you're working on, that you've realized, this is something I'd like to change about myself at work, or I don't know, even in your personal life, or any skills that you are particularly working on at the moment?
Yes, but this might not go in the way you think it will. So recently, It's a neighbour just waved to me. It's a funny thing, isn't it? Recently, a guy got in contact with me about and he'd contacted the other members of a band I was in the early 1980s and said, look, I've just heard that album of yours that you never released. I want to get it remastered and release it. He said, I think it's amazing. And I haven't really picked up my bass guitars for a while, so, they're here now. And after I finish doing what I'm doing for my academic work, I've picked that up again, and I've bought some new equipment, and weirdly it's so much cheaper than it used to be, and it's smaller and easier to use. So instead of a big, I used to have this mixing desk. It's only a 4-track, but still it was elaborate, and now I've got this tiny little thing and a piece of software on the computer that kind of does everything that used to do in a fraction of the cost. So yeah, that's my skill development at the moment, is I'm trying to get a bit more competent at bass guitar again, and and guitar and so on. And so yeah, this has got nothing to do with my work really, but it's more personal, let's say personal redevelopment. Yeah. But it is quite weird that that after all these years, I may have this, I and my bandmates will have our unreleased album released.
That is fantastic.
Very weird.
Yeah, there's something that's really interesting about that. So, because I remember last time we spoke, you told me about those days where you were sort of, it was rock and roll, and it was probably quite sort of partying, that sort of thing when you were younger. And I wasn't in a band when I was younger, but I certainly had my sort of partying days. And I definitely feel like there's been like an identity shift for me over the years, and the way I see myself now is very different. It's calmer and a bit more focused on family and work and that sort of thing. It's interesting now you're picking that stuff back up. Obviously you're a bit older now than you were then, but did you notice that identity shift? Did that happen for you? And at what point did that happen?
Yes, well, I think I mentioned earlier about starting nursing at the age of 27, and I think that was where that was a big change then. And after about a year after I started nursing, I met my wife at a nurse's home party. So it was quite a momentous period. But doing shift work, it was very hard to do music, and I really kind of put it aside. It came back. I played in a number of bands in between time, but they were much more secondary to what I was otherwise doing. But yes, look, I think those particular days, interestingly, we didn't have mobile phones or computers. If we wanted to see if somebody was home and wanted to go out or whatever, we often had to go around to their place and knock on their door. Mm-hmm. So, because not everybody had a telephone. And I think it was, in many ways, it was pretty chill back then. It was fairly relaxed in many ways. And I was definitely thinner and fitter because I walked a real lot. And but yeah, the identity shift, I think, really came around about that period of time when I decided to do nursing, and all that came with it. It was a huge learning curve as well, just dealing with people with serious mental illness and meeting a whole new bunch of people with sometimes rather different ideas. It was very interesting, and quite mind expanding. So, I think a lot of things changed, but I reckon I'm essentially the same person. I can still be a little bit wild.
Tell me more about that. Go on.
Well, now, and back then, I suppose I wasn't as educated about things like wine, for example, and
Right.
That's a key, it's a key aspect of my life, and perhaps got to do with why I've got a few kilos more than I should have. So there are those sorts of things, the maturity and food, for example. I went back in those days, particularly when I was working as a musician. I usually only ate 2 meals a day because of the hours that I kept, which was like 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. or something like that for quite a few years. A lot of things have changed, I guess. And these days I wake up at 6 o'clock a.m. So, there's lots of little things that I think are different.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I'm essentially the same person, and occasionally I just get a bit out of hand, and I realised it. Privately.
What do you think your 21-year-old self would say if he saw you now, or say about you?
Look, that's a very good question. I almost would have to think about that. I do remember thinking when I was on my 21st birthday, around about that time, I remember thinking how old I would be in the year 2000, and that was quite a shock to think about that. But, of course, the year 2000 has flashed by, and here we are. Here I am.
Yeah.
I really don't know. I would probably have wondered whether I still had an interest in radical politics. Well, I do in a way, but it's much more measured. I guess I'm much more pragmatic. I think I could be a bit ideological and a bit dogmatic in a way when I was that age. I'm probably just a bit more measured and pragmatic. I think that's probably the main things, and my tastes have definitely evolved.
Finer wine.
Yeah, good food.
Yeah.
And, my musical tastes have changed a little bit too. But, it's very interesting because when I listen to the music from the band, the band is called the Critics from that time, even though it kind of went on for about 4 or 5 years, maybe even a little bit less. But it was just such a monumental period. And I still, when I listen to the music, I think, it's a bit 1980s, but wow, we were bloody good. Really tight band, very interesting things that we were doing, and I think it's pretty impressive actually to think that I was doing that back then. And it's a shame in a way that it didn't go on. But that's life happens.
Do you have any regrets from the past, from that?
Or anywhere else? No. I mean, there were some things I think in my life I could have been a nicer person, or done things with more maturity. But of course, I didn't have maturity. That was the problem. I was a young bloke, and you can look back. I think if you were able to go forward and then look back and then go back again, and it might make a difference, but no. So, no, I don't really have any regrets. It probably would have been nice if I'd started my academic career a bit earlier, but when I went to university, it was all sex, drugs and rock and roll. So that was, that was the story, really.
Yeah. So it sounds like a fantastic time. It's, I think it's really great to hear about stories about people like yourself who, I don't know, especially for younger people who are, say that 18, 19, 20, 21, doing their undergraduate degree, who feel a lot of pressure from society, from parents, from peer groups to have things figured out and feel like they need to know what they're going to do at 21 or 22. And I think it's really great to hear when people like yourself, you've dabbled a bit with being in a band and those sorts of things. It wasn't until your late 20s that I suppose quite fortunately you found nursing, and that ended up being the thing that you were really passionate about. But people, it's just important that people do keep their options open, and life is long, isn't it, for most people?
Yes, well, I think it is. I think it is for most people, and it's getting longer, and that's a big change in human history and human society. So, and I think the idea of a career is ludicrous.
Yeah.
I think the norm will be that people have many careers.
Yeah.
It could be 4 or 5, might become normal.
Yeah.
Very normal.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. Danny, I know we're going to have to finish up soon, so I just got one last question. You obviously, we talked before that you actually think quite strategically about the future. I'm interested whether you've thought at all about the person you want to be moving forward, and whether who you want to become, what's important to you about the next several years of your life, or even beyond that.
I'm starting to think about that more, actually, as I'm moving towards retirement age. That, and thinking, well, I've had quite a bit of discussion with my wife about this, naturally, and I mean, she says the same thing. She can't imagine me not doing something constructive, work of some sort. That's becoming more. It's not becoming as abnormal as it used to be. This notion of retiring used to be that you stopped work and then you kind of moved in towards the last bit of your life, but it's just not like that anymore. And I think that's how it's going to be, unless I became very, very wealthy all of a sudden. And I just still think that I'd do something that was vocational in some kind of way, not just a hobby, but something that actually was meaningful, and maybe continue to earn an income. So I'm not 100% sure what that will be yet, but I can imagine that in future years I'll probably move back to something that's got more, that provides some social good in some way. Not sure what that'll be. A bit hard to tell at this stage.
Yeah. It sounds like you're pretty happy with who you are as a person. You seem like somebody who's quite comfortable with who they are, and
it's pretty good.
Yeah, it makes things a bit easier, I guess, doesn't it? You're not feeling like you've got lots of loads of self work to do, and actually just focusing on the extending the things that are interesting to you and important to you with your career, and yeah.
Well, look, I would say this one thing, that I think nursing and, in fact, any of the health professions, psychology, social work, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, any of these, inherent in that work where you're working with people, you really do have to confront some of your own issues, characteristics, shortcomings, whatever. So I think doing this kind of work, working with people, can be a really constructive experience and can help you come to terms with any issues you may have, I think, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that. Well, Danny, it's been wonderful talking to you again. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And like I said, I'll put some links to your research and stuff in the show notes. And hopefully we can catch up again soon.